I'm going to be making this slipper on the 24 peg loom, and this is an adult slipper. There's no control over how wide the slipper comes out unless you do really tight stitches. It would not be suitable for a child. You have control over the length of the slipper but not the width of the slipper. For my slipper, I decided to allow 4 inches for the toe and 5 inches for the foot portion because my foot measures 9 inches. You could decide if you want to go 50-50 or 40-60%. I found that I needed a little more room to get my foot in the opening because I used a slip stitch for the ankle portion. I slipped 1 stitch on every row just to tighten that up. If you want to, you can do a crochet at the top to tighten it up, but I felt like I needed more room to get my foot in because this portion is not very stretchy with this yarn. I'm using Lion Brand Hometown. It's a super bulky size 6 yarn, and if you're going to use a thinner yarn, you probably are going to need to double up, but I haven't tested this pattern with thinner yarn. You're going to need some smooth cord, at least as thick as the yarn you're using, but maybe a little thicker would be better. You don't want to go thinner because the loop needs to be big enough to stretch over the pegs in the part where we hang the loops on the empty pegs. You won't be able to stretch it out if your loops are too small. So use a smooth cord like clothesline cord or paracord, or some of the macrame cords are really smooth. This one I've used over and over again. Once it starts getting fuzzy, you'll want to throw it away because then your hook will start catching on the little loops. So I cut this one it's about 18 inches. So just enough to where you don't lose the cord or it starts coming out of the stitches. You want enough to work with. And also I marked my loom with a piece of yarn, a bright colored yarn. To begin with, we're going to be using this as our starting point, but later on in the pattern we're going to be using this as our starting point, and we don't want to get confused about where to begin and end. So that's 6 pegs in. I've put a marker between peg number 6 and 7. If you've never done short row before, you're going to want to keep a pad of paper handy so that I can demonstrate to you how it's done. Once you've done this a couple of times, you'll not need the pad of paper because you'll be able to recognize your stitches immediately. But to begin with, it helps to understand the short row technique if you write everything down. So the first thing I want to do is take my piece of cord, and somewhere close to the beginning here I'm going to just tie it on just in a simple tie, just to hold it there so it doesn't come out when I'm trying to wrap my stitches around it. And this cast on method is a provisional cast on, and it's commonly used in hand knitting where you're going to use those stitches that you're leaving live. You're going to do something with them later, and often they'll use either another needle or the cable of a circular needle to do this. But in our case, we're going to be using this cord. And what's going to happen is our stitches are going to be wrapped around and around this cord, and the tail is going to start getting tangled up. So as I go along, I'm going to stop and untangle the tail until I get all the pegs cast on that I need. For the toe portion of the slipper, we're going to be using 12 pegs, and the other 12 pegs on the loom are just going to be just sitting there waiting for us to do something with them later. So I'm going to count over 12 pegs from my beginning. So this is number 1, and I already have a marker at 6. So the 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I'm just going to hang a little marker there so I'll know where to stop. And I'm going to get my cords ready for the cast on. tie a slip knot in your main yarn, pass it through the loom, and hang it on that anchor peg and tighten that up. That's normally the first step in all of these projects. So now I have both of my cords, my yarn and my cord, coming up through the middle of the loom. And my yarn is feeding off the ball of yarn freely. So I'm going to use a crochet hook to show this to you because my hand will get in the way of the camera if I don't. So here's my first peg. Here's my anchor peg. Here's my peg number 1. So I'm going to reach under the cord and grab a loop of yarn and place it over that first peg and snug that up. Then I'm going to straighten everything out again, back out again like this. You don't want to pull this under or anything like that. You want to make sure they're both look like they did before. It's coming around the peg. This yarn is out over here on this side where it started, and then you have your cord in the back. So that's the cast on for the first peg, and I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to reach under, grab that yarn, and wrap it around the next peg, and then I'm going to straighten everything out. And I'm going to keep those pretty snug around the pegs. They can loosen up on you when you're doing this because everything starts getting tangled and then you let up on it. So I've got them both, one coming out this way and one coming across the back. So I'm going to reach under that cord, pull that loop out, and then around the next peg. Straighten everything out again and just keep repeating. Always going under from front to back under the cord. Reaching behind, pulling that to the back, and then around the next peg. Usually I'm holding this loom up, so it's a little awkward for me to do it like this, but I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. Then I'm going to do 12 pegs that way, straightening up my loops each time. Going under and then over. Under and then over. And now I'm at the last peg. I'm just going to hook that on here for now just to show you. Okay, so I should have 12 pegs with a loop on a blue piece of yarn on it, and I want to make sure that loop is all the way to the back. Just tighten up your cord, snug everything up. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I should also have 12 loops on the cord. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Sometimes this 12th loop can come off when you get ready to, when you get to the end of the project, then you've lost that last loop. So we're going to start knitting back in the other direction. So I'm going to count, make sure I still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I'm just going to loop that around to get it out of the way. So I'm going to snug everything up, and then I'm going to work back to my beginning peg. For this row, you can just go ahead and E-wrap every peg, but from now on, after that first initial row, we're going to be knitting each peg one by one. So I'm going to go ahead and E-wrap all of those 12 pegs. And I'm wrapping the pegs clockwise because I'm going from left to right. And then I'm going to knit those off. We're ignoring this marker for now. We don't need it right now. Right now our marker is the anchor peg. Alright, that's 12 stitches. This is going to be the toe. So I knitted 12 to the right. Now I'm going to start the short rows. I'm going to knit 11 to the left, and I'm going to stop short before I get to the 12th peg. That's what short row means. And what we're going to be ultimately doing is we have 12 pegs, so we're going to be wrapping 4 on the ends, and then we'll have 4 in the middle that continue to knit, and you're going to end up with this wedge shape. And you're going to have 4 needles in the middle that have been allowed to knit, and these 4 pegs will have been taken out of work. It'll make more sense as we do this, but then you'll end up with more stitches in the middle, or more rows, and that will give you the toe cup, and these will act as little darts. And then we're going to start increasing back out again to where we have all 12 pegs back in work. And this is going to create your toe cup. And when I say dart, this is going to be the dart, and it'll all make sense as we go along. So I'm going to knit 11 going back. So this time I need to wrap counterclockwise around each peg. But I'm going to do these one by one. Let me go ahead and knit those. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I knitted, sorry about that, I can't write with a crochet hook, 11 to the left. And so the 12th peg has not been knit. So I need to wrap it, and normally you would take your yarn and wrap the peg, or you would take that loop off and wrap underneath it. But I found the first time I did this slipper that these left really loopy things on the edges of my slipper, and I didn't like it. So I want it to be a tighter wrap. So I'm going to steal a stitch from this peg here. So I'm going to look at the back, and I'm going to take, this is the loop that we just dropped over. So I'm going to take a stitch from below if I can. If it's not stretchy enough to get over to the peg, then I'll take the loop that I just dropped. Either way, you're going to get a tight wrap. So here's the loop that we just dropped over, and here's the loop below that. I've done it both ways using the loop that I just dropped over or that other loop. So whichever one's easier for you to pull over. This is all on the inside, it's not going to show. So now this 12th peg has 2 loops on it. So I've wrapped it, now I'm going to turn. This is called a wrap and turn. So on the way back I need to knit 10 stitches. So I'm wrapping clockwise. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm stopping short of the last peg. So I've knit 10 to the right, and I need to wrap that peg. So same thing, I'm going to look back here. You can either look like this or turn it around this way. And I'm going to look at the loop that I just dropped over and go below that and grab a loop, trying not to split my yarn, and then just stretch it over to that outside peg, the one that's to the outside of the one we just knit. And now I have that peg wrapped. Don't get confused about when you get ready to knit in the other direction and knit it. You don't want to knit it right now. You want to wait. That's the whole point of the short row. So now I need to knit in the other direction. 9. Let's see, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I wasn't sure if I wrote it down, so I need to go 9 in the other direction. So I'm going to wrap counterclockwise. Sometimes it's hard for my brain to switch directions. 2, 3, 4, and that's 9. So I'm going to write it down, 9. And now I need to wrap that peg. So I'm going to steal a stitch from the one that I just knit and move it over to the stitch that's closer to the outside. So this is the one I just dropped over. I'm going to take the next bump on the back and stretch it over. If I can. If I can't, I'll choose a different loop. So that peg has been wrapped. You can see we have 2 wrapped pegs. We're going to continue back and forth until we have 4 wrapped pegs on each side and the 4 pegs in the middle have been knit. So now I'm going to knit in the other direction for 8 stitches. Six, 7, 8. So now I need to excuse me, wrap this peg. So this is the stitch I just dropped over. So I'm going to find a loop that I can use. And wrap that next peg toward the outside. So I have 2 loops, 2 pegs on each side now that have been wrapped. Now I'm going to work back in the other direction. I need to go 7 now. Okay, that's 7. I'm going to choose a loop on the back. So now I have 3 wrapped pegs. Now I need to go 6. You can fast forward if you've got this down, but I want to film the whole thing. That's 6. That's 5. And then I want to wrap. You don't want to grab this bar that's being stretched from one peg to the other. You want to grab the loop that is below that last stitch that you dropped over. So I have 4 wraps on this side, so I'm completed with my wraps and turns on the left side. So I'm going to knit back in the other direction 4 stitches. And that'll be the completion of my 4 pegs in the middle. 3, 4. And now I need to wrap. I have 3. I need to wrap this last one on this side. So let me write down 4. And there's my little loop. So now we're ready for the next part, the increase. So now we're going to start the increase. This was the decrease. We decreased down to 4 working pegs. So now we're going to increase out until we have all 12 pegs back working again. So when I go back in the other direction, I now need to knit 5. So the way you do that is just knit over to that place where we wrap those pegs. Sometimes so that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my working pegs, and I need to put this peg back in work. So I'm just going to wrap my E-wrap, and then I'm going to drop over. Sometimes I'll do the bottom stitch first. It depends on how tight you need it to be. So I think what I'm going to do here is start from the bottom and drop those over. So we'll drop those 2 loops over the top. So now this peg needs to be wrapped because we're going to turn back. So we did 5 stitches, and I need to figure out which loop to use as a wrap. We don't want to use the loops there, but we're going to have to find a loop that will reach because we want to close that gap up right there. So let me try this loop and see if I can get it to reach over. Sometimes you just have to play it by ear. And tight is good because then you don't end up with all those loopy things on the edge. So now this peg has 3 loops on it, and we have 3 pegs on this side that still are not in work. So I'm going to work my way over to the other side, and now I need to knit 6 stitches. So there's my wrapped peg. I'm going to go back in the other direction. Okay, there's my 6th peg. So I need to knit it. So whatever you did on the other side, do on this side, whichever ones you decide to pop over. So now I've knit 6. I need to wrap this peg, so I'm going to find a loop that I can use. See if that one's going to be stretchy enough to go over. Now that one has 3 loops on it. I'm going to now knit 7. Six. So I need to put these over one by one. And that is 7. Now I need to wrap the next peg. That one's really tight. I might have trouble when I get ready to knit that one. So I'm going to knit 8 this time. So I'm going to knit this one by dropping all those loops over. And I need to wrap that one. It's really hard sometimes to see the stitch that you want to use. If it doesn't look right to you, just take it back off and choose a different loop. Just kind of look at how the gap looks, because it's really hard to tell which loop you need to use when you're using really thick yarn like this. So I haven't been writing down my stitches. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I've knit 8. And then we're going to continue doing this. So I need 9 now. That's 8, and then 9. That one is tight. That's the one I told you a while ago. I thought it was going to be too tight. So that's 9. So I'm going to wrap the last peg on this side. There's my gap. I need to close that gap. That one's not going to work. Let me try this one right here. And that looks good. So I need to do 10, that's 9, and then 10. I need to wrap the last peg on this side. See if that one will reach. Don't think it will. See if this one will. I'm grabbing too many loops. Sorry if this is making you confused. So now I'm going to knit 11. Okay, now I'm unwrapping or knitting the last peg. Get rid of that marker. But I want to go ahead and wrap this empty peg even though it doesn't have a stitch on it. So that's going to help close up the gap when we start putting these needles all back in work. So let's see which stitch I want to use. This takes a little bit of time to get through the toe portion, but it makes a very nice slipper shaped toe instead of the gathered toe. So we have to keep in mind that this is not our 12th needle. It can get confusing when we come back. This stitch has never been, this peg has never been knit. So when we start our back and forth rows, we need to remember that that peg has not been knit. So let me knit back and unwrap that peg. So that was 11. So after you've done this, you can see that you really don't need to write it down, because the pegs, you'll recognize immediately where to stop, because the pegs will have 2 loops on them or 3, and so you'll know immediately where you are. Without counting. So this is the last one that I need to take care of. That was tight. I need to loosen that up so I can get it over. And so that's the final peg on that side. So we finished our increase, but I want to wrap this outside peg also. Just find a loop that you can use that won't be messy, and close that gap. Alright, I can release my cord now, because we're going to start rehanging or hanging all those loops on the provisional cast on. We're going to start hanging them on the pegs for the next step. Okay, we want to make sure we know where all 12 of the loops on our cord is. I still have my yarn tied to the anchor peg, because that is anchoring this first loop that is around my cord. Sometimes that one will come off, and then you get around to that peg and you don't have a loop to hang. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I know where all my loops are now. So I'm going to knit over. I'm not going to knit that peg because that's the peg that I wrapped, just to close the gap. So I'm going to still start with the first peg that is to the left of this anchor peg, and I'm going to knit all the way over to where I need to start hanging stitches. So I'm not going to start my slips yet. I'm just going to go ahead and knit every peg. Okay, this is number 12. Remember, this was a peg that was not being used. I need to hang my first loop on that peg, the first loop that I see on my cord. So I need to take it off of the cord, pull the cord out of it, and hang it on that same peg that I have that wrap on. So peg number 13 is going to have 2 loops on it. So you can hang a few of these loops at a time. I don't like to do all of them because if you knit as you go, then you won't be so tight on the other end. The last few are going to be really hard to hang, so I'm going to do about 3 for now. And do them in order and try not to skip any. My hook keeps getting tangled in those loops as my yarn is splitting. So each time I'm going to pull the cord out of that stitch that I just rehung. So now I'm going to knit the few that I've already done. So I need to knit peg number 13 that has 2 loops on it. And I think that I'm going to bring the bottom over first if I can. So that's the 4 that I just I just put them back into work. So now I'm going to do a couple more at a time. Pull this out, pull on my cord so I'll know where those stitches are. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. They're starting to get tight, so I'm just going to go ahead and knit these. Out. Can get really confusing at the end. And sometimes I'll go ahead and release that peg even though I may lose my loop on the end, because if it's too tight you may have to release it. Just take your time and make sure you get all of those pegs with a loop on them. Sometimes you can work from the back side of the loom better than from the front side. Just do what's easier for you to see, and that's really tight, so I'm going to go ahead and knit that peg. Pull on it. Go ahead and take my cord out. Give me a little bit better visibility. And then pull it over to that peg. Go ahead and knit that. And it looks like we only have one left to do, but we have to do this one too. This is that peg that I wrapped. So pull your cord up so you can see your stitches. And I think I'm going to have to go ahead and release this because it's just too tight for me to pull up my yarn. Pull my cord out. Alright, I'm down to one stitch, and this is just a loose cord, so I'm going to go ahead and hang that onto that 24th peg and take that out. And if you have to, you can re-anchor this around the loop, but I'll usually just tighten it. And I've left a little knot there to kind of help it stay in. I can take that out later. But now the 24th peg is going to have 2 loops on it. Later on we're going to thread this back to the inside and tighten up this loop at the end when we clean everything up. So now I need to knit those pegs that have not been knit yet. So where I'm coming off of is the last peg that I knit. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the round and then pull on that, snug it up, and then drop these 2 over. This one's going to be loose right here. Alright, so now we're ready to start the top of the foot. I've already completed one round, and I'm going to start keeping track so that I can do the second slipper the same size. This is actually my second slipper, so I already know how many rows I need to do. But you would just keep track, and it's kind of hard to measure right now because it's being pulled in the loom, but what you would measure, you'd stick your tape measure inside and measure from the tip of the toe to the edge of your knitting, and you would pull out to size the stitches and let the fabric relax when you measure. But continue till you get your toe the length that you want it to be, and I'm going to go 4 inches on mine. Just want to point out that you should begin every round on the same peg. This is number 1. Sometimes it can get confusing because when I've taught this before and I'm wrapping my pegs, I get back to the beginning and then I want to let go of my yarn, so I always wrap or I knit the last peg first. So when you come around, you'll think that this is your starting peg because this one has already been knit. But always look at the back of the stitch, and whatever peg that it's coming off of is the last stitch that you knit. So always begin every round with the same peg. Don't stop short, because if you keep drifting over, then your beginning will be wrong. So if you're new to this, just pay attention to where that yarn is coming off of that last stitch. But the reason I knit that one first is just so that I could let go of the yarn. I didn't want to hold it all the way around. If you let go, these E-wraps are pretty lively and they'll just start unraveling. So I need to do 6 rounds for the top of my foot because that's what I did on the previous slipper. But if your foot is smaller than mine, then you would need fewer rounds. But I'm going to show you how to measure. So I'm back to the beginning. Here's where my last peg is. So that's 5 rounds for me. Push all the stitches down, and I can actually count how many rounds that I did for this portion right here, because you can see the difference in the stitches. This was my short row toe, and then I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the round, which is what I'm doing now. So for me, I need to go one more round because I've kept track of 5, and I can go ahead and measure, or you can measure at this point. Just pull out on the knitting to set those stitches, and then get your tape measure, and you're going to stick it inside of the slipper. Just flatten that out and put your tape measure in there, and just hold on to it, and then just measure about what you have. It looks like I'm going a little bit more than 4 inches for my toe, but I want to do the second slipper exactly like I did the first one, so I'm going to go 6 rounds. So you would decide where you want to stop, and I would recommend at least half of the measurement of your foot so that you'll be able to get your foot through the opening of the slipper. So I'm going to knit one more round, and then we'll come back. Okay, I finished my 6 rounds. So now we're going to start working back and forth all the way to the heel. We're going to be going and stopping at the gap and turning around and going back, and then going to the gap and turning around and going back until we get this whole length of the heel, and then we're going to hand seam the back of the heel. So to do that, first I need to make my way over to where that gap in my slipper is going to be. I'm working my way over 6 stitches until I get to the gap. And that's why I put this marker here. So my rows are going to start now. This is going to be my first peg, and I'm going to be working over to the last peg and then back and forth. So let me just do that. So I'm going to get myself over there by just knitting up to that peg. So I'm going to knit 6 pegs. Okay, so now I need to reverse, and to make sure I don't forget where that gap is, I'm going to keep my eye on the marker. If you forget and go past it, you're going to end up with a piece of yarn going through your gap there, and there's no way to fix that unless you start unraveling some rows that you already knitted, and that's not a lot of fun. So keep your tape measure handy, because we need to measure for the amount that you're going to knit to the end of your foot. So I want to slip the first peg of every row, and that's going to make a little bit longer stitch here on the edge, but it's going to be a neater edge, and it does tighten everything up a little bit around the ankle. If you don't want to slip the first peg, just go ahead and knit it, but you may have to tighten up your slipper with crochet or something at the end, especially if you have a more narrow foot, because these pegs are far apart. You're going to get sort of a wide slipper, so this would be good for an adult. So I'm going to knit back, but I'm going to skip this first peg. I'm going to slip it. And the way you do that is you just simply don't knit it. And I'm going to knit all the way to the last peg. And then I'm going to slip this peg and work back. And when I come back, then I'm going to knit that. So it'll now be the last. So I'm going to try to just show you that now. So I can go ahead and wrap all of my pegs to make this faster. And I'm going to try to ignore that anchor peg. Every now and then, if I get to daydreaming, I stop there and I go back, because I'm so used to that being my marker. But keep your eye on that pink yarn or whatever you use as your marker. So I'm going to stop at the gap, Here's my gap right here. And I'm going to just loop that over just to hold that yarn. And then I'm going to knit all the way back to the beginning. You can go in either direction. It doesn't matter. So I've actually, when I get to the end of this, I will have slipped one peg and knit 23. Okay, I knit in that one direction. I've done one row of, I'm calling it the heel portion, but it's really just the back of the foot all the way to the heel. And just to keep track of where I am, I'm on this side of the gap. You can see the gap starting to form right there. And so I'm pulling on my yarn to see which direction I need to go. So now I'm at this last peg and I need to work my way back to the gap on the other side. So I'm going to slip the first peg and go back. So I'm slipping one and knitting 23. So I'm just going to wrap all my pegs. And for my slipper, I need to do 16 rows like this because that's what I knit on my other slipper. But you're going to be measuring as you go, just like I showed you before. Just pull on your fabric to set those stitches, let the fabric relax, and then just measure as you go if you're not sure. Your gauge may be a little different than mine. You may knit tighter than I do. So it's best to not go by the numbers that I'm doing. So now I'm knitting that stitch that I slipped to begin with, but I slipped the first peg going in this direction. So I'm going to knit that row. I'm going to finish knitting off and then I'll come back after I've done a few rows. I really didn't take time to explain this before, but when you're doing E-wrap stitch, if you're working your way clockwise around the loom, you're going to wrap your pegs counterclockwise. If you're working counterclockwise around the loom, you'd wrap your pegs in the opposite way, which would be clockwise. So if I were to wrap this clockwise and I'm moving counterclockwise around the loom, if I wrap my peg this way, I'm going to end up with extra stuff going here on the front, and you'll know you're doing it wrong. It's pretty intuitive, so just make sure you're wrapping your pegs correctly. I'm slipping this first peg, so I'm going to continue back to the gap on the other side. I completed 8 rows back and forth, and so it's time for me to measure to see if my gauge is just about what I was doing on the first slipper. So I set the stitches by pulling on that, and then I let it relax, and then I'm going to measure my progress. Stick the tape measure up into the toe and then just measure. So I've got about 6.5 inches total done. You can do about a ½ inch shorter than your actual foot, or an inch, ½ inch to an inch shorter if you want the slipper to be more snug on your foot. I finished my 16 rows back and forth to do the back portion of my slipper, so I'm ready for the bind off. And for a bind off, you need to start with two new knit stitches, and every peg is going to be knit one more time. So here's the sequence. I'm going to knit the setup, which is the to knit these first 2 pegs. Knit that one and the next one. So now I have my setup pegs. So I need to now bind off the first peg, so I'm going to move the second new stitch over to the first peg and bind off. I'm going to transfer that stitch back where it came from. So now for the rest of the pegs, we're going to do this 4-step sequence. Remember, every peg is going to have a new stitch put on it. This one already has. So we're going to go over to the next new stitch. We're going to knit, that's step 1. We're going to transfer that backward, that's step 2. We're going to bind off, that's step 3, and then we're going to transfer forward. Knit the next new peg, knit, transfer back, bind off, transfer forward. And you see me tightening this as I go because I find it easier to use my fingers, but you can use your hook if you want to. Knit, transfer back, bind off, transfer forward, knit, transfer back, bind off, transfer forward, and keep going. And that's a bind off and transfer forward. I'm going to do one more and then rewind the video if you need to remember how to do this until you get it down. So I'm going to knit the next new peg, transfer back, bind off, transfer forward, and that's the 4 steps. Got to finish the last 2 stitches, so I'm going to knit that stitch, transfer back, bind off that stitch, and then I just need to bind off this stitch here. So I'm just going to pull the loop through. I'm going to cut, leaving enough of a tail so I can sew a seam, and then I'm just going to pull that loop through. So we're finished with the bind off, and we're going to whip stitch the back seam together. Okay, I've got my tail threaded onto a yarn needle and I want to choose the right loops to neatly sew this together. You can go through both legs of the knit stitch that's showing on the edge there. This is our bind off row. You can go through both loops or you can just go through one. I'm just going to go through one. But first I need to secure the corner. So I'm just going to connect the corner there right at the top. And now I'm going to twist these stitches around to where I can see the little V. It looks like the letter V. And that to me will be a neater seam if I just grab one. Sometimes if you're using a thinner yarn, you might need to grab both legs to give the seam more strength, but this is pretty thick. So now I'm just going to whip stitch all the way down to the corner of the heel. And usually I'll peek back inside there so I can see where I left off. And pull it pretty snug. And be consistent where you put your hook. If you started on these loops, just continue all the way down with the same sequence. And the seam will be really neat. So you can tighten up as you go if you need to. I'm going to continue all the way to the corner. I've reached the corner and I've got 2 stitches here that are kind of angled toward each other that I need to finish connecting. And I'm done with the seam, but I don't want to cut my yarn yet. So you can choose this to be the outside of the slipper, or you can choose the other side, whichever one you prefer. I'm going to make this the outside of my slipper. But I want to smooth out this heel a little bit. So I'm going to just kind of open it out, squish that down with my thumb. And I'm going to take a few extra stitches just in and out of these loops where they won't show. I'm going to just kind of gather up the heel. You don't have to do this because normally if you wear the slipper for a while, it's going to conform to your foot. So I'm just kind of pulling on it and it gathers that up a little bit right there. Then I'm going to travel through to the other side and back around again to smooth out that heel. And I'm kind of tugging on it while I'm squishing. Now I need to pass my yarn through to the inside of the slipper and weave my yarn tails in and clip the tail off short. I'm just going to weave it through a few stitches. And then cut that. And this other tail I need to push through to the inside also and make sure my toe looks the way I want it to. I may need to clean up some of the gaps, but this one looks pretty good. So I'm going to push this through to the inside with my needle, and I'm going to weave the tail in on that side also. The slipper is now finished unless you want to add some other edging around the top. And since I slip stitch, you're going to have these longer looking stitches because they had to go 2 rows, but you don't get the knit and then a little knot and then a knit and a knot from when you turn around and go back in the other direction. So I like the look of the slipped stitches at the beginning of every row. And you can crochet a lace edging or whatever if you want to embellish this slipper anymore. So let's put it on the mannequin and see what it looks like. You can blast this with a little bit of steam to block it, but it's not really necessary.